The North Atlantic Treaty Organization will soon need new talent to keep its work going forward. Thinking strategically about the future of NATO could include an approach developed for the next generation with the next generation. Lauren Speranza is Director of Transatlantic Defense and Security at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Lauren, welcome. Thanks for coming on the program. That line is taken from your work, an agenda for NATO's next generation. Define what that means for the next generation with the next generation.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I would say the next generation, in large part thanks to NATO, has experienced the longest period of relative peace in history. But what we need to recognize is that this means a whole new generation of post-Cold War citizens of the alliance have grown up in an entirely different environment, less characterized by great power conflict and more characterized by things like disinformation and cyber attacks and health crises. And as these individuals are beginning to take up roles in national governments and institutions like NATO, they have a much different set of priorities that are more in line with future threats. And the alliance can't risk losing these rising voices. And if they don't bring them into the fold now, we could end up in a scenario in which NATO is viewed as outdated, doesn't have the buy-in of the next generation of political leaders. And at that point, NATO could risk retirement. So to attract future leaders, NATO has to start to take on some of these issues, becoming more global, dynamic, and diverse. And this means giving young leaders a chance to contribute to NATO's debates and policies and doing a better job of not just creating separate youth formats for them, but actually having them sit at the adults table and work shoulder to shoulder inside the alliance so that they can build the relationships and insights and experiences that will keep the alliance healthy and alive for years to come.
What is the kind of the general thought process, if there is one, among that cohort of people who should be the next generation of leaders in NATO? The broader dialogue seems to be, is NATO a success, or do we have peace because of NATO or despite NATO? And I wonder if that's the same idea that's happening among this cohort of next generation leaders.
Sure. So I think a lot of next generation leaders, they care about transatlantic cooperation. They understand that NATO is important and that we need allies and friends and partners in the world to tackle shared global challenges. But they care less about traditional security and military issues and more about the issues that they've seen, fake news and election interference and hacking and climate change. So for them, it's about making sure that NATO is fit for purpose, that it's relevant, and that it can take on those issues that matter to them and that will increasingly matter to all of us in the future.
You have a very robust list of short, medium, and long-term priorities for the next generation of NATO, and I don't have time, unfortunately, to ask you about all of them, but there's one of each that I want to pursue. In short-term priorities, one of them is adapting for hybrid threats. What's a hybrid threat, Lauren?
Sure. So hybrid threats are things like information operations, economic coercion, infrastructure attacks, cyber hacks. These are things that fall below the traditional threshold of military conflict. And so they're very difficult to tackle, especially for a military alliance like NATO. But this matters to millennials and Gen Zs because they're growing up in a world where these are so prevalent. And these hybrid threats are part of foreign malign influence campaigns that Beijing and Moscow are waging against the transatlantic community. And I would say we're in the hybrid war right now. These things are happening all around us: chemical attacks, election interference. And we need to take the initiative as the alliance and get ahead of the curve and not just stand by and react.
A medium-term priority that you suggest is building a digital NATO. Does that mean digital operations in each country, in each of the member NATO countries, or NATO as its own entity building a digital NATO?
I would say it's a little bit of both. So NATO itself needs to go digital in terms of transitioning to cloud infrastructure and using more digital technologies itself to do key things like collecting intelligence and sharing data. And it also means thinking about data as more of a strategic capability. So not just being able to use it and collect it and share it as a source of information, but also as a tool to counter some of these threats. And so it's, yes, NATO internally going digital, but also being able to extend that to its core functions of intelligence and also command and control infrastructure and things like that.
One of the long-term priorities that you suggest is making inclusion a reality. What does inclusion look like, Lauren, in a multinational treaty organization?
Sure. So I think that the next generation of leaders tends to think about diversity and inclusion not as just statistics, how many women or how many of this religious minority or how many of this ethnic background, but really diversity of thought and ideas, opportunities to contribute. And at a entirely hierarchical structure like NATO, that's difficult to afford young people the same kind of opportunities who don't have as much experience or seniority. And so I think what young people want to see is an alliance that looks like them, that reflects their priorities, and where they have a voice and can be heard. So bringing these people, these young leaders into the alliance, giving them roles on the inside and not just giving them, a sort of kids table to contribute to, but really bringing them into the fold is what they'd like to see.
Lauren Speranza, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.